Hello, and welcome to the History of Philosophy in China by Peter Adamson and Karen Lai, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich. Online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, Let Us Count the Ways. What is Daoism? We sometimes hear that not only is Taoist philosophy a reaction to Confucian philosophy, it goes further to challenge and reject Confucian views. While Confucian philosophy upholds a vision of ritualized life within an ethical and political hierarchy, institutionalized through the moral insights of the benevolent ruler, Taoist philosophy is said to advocate for a ruler who embraces non-action, wu wei, and who nurtures a spontaneous approach to life, perhaps even encouraging his people to go with the flow. But is this right? Were these two philosophies really antithetical to one another? In the coming episodes, we're going to find out by considering two Warring States Taoist texts, the Lao Tzu, also known as the Tao Te Ching, and the Shuangzi. Before we do that, let's look at what we might mean by Taoism. There is no phrase in ancient Chinese texts that directly corresponds to Taoism. That would refer to a group of texts or thinkers, or their views, specifically associated with the idea of Tao, or Wei. As you might remember, we started this whole series on classical China by thinking about Tao. In the very first episode, we suggested that the word Tao in Warring State China was used generally to refer to a teaching or a doctrine or a set of practices. In this usage, Tao was not associated to any particular set of ideas or significant figures. So we might say that a Moist advocates Mo Tao, the Moist way, and a Confucian advocates Ru Tao, the way of the Ru scholar official. But obviously, it would be unhelpful to say that all classical Chinese philosophers were Taoists. Rather, the word Taoism, with that suffix ism, suggests that we are talking about a specific set of ideas. But it's not straightforward to say what those ideas might be, as there are no texts of the time that identify them clearly and authoritatively. Then, too, the word Tao is used differently in various texts that are considered Taoist. To decide which texts represent or best represent Taoism, we would already need to know what we mean by the term. Thankfully, there are some hints that can help us get started as we try to understand Taoist philosophy. One of the earliest uses of Tao to refer to a distinct set of ideas appears in Sima Qian's Shi Ji, or the Records of the Grand Historian. We introduced this text in episode 4 and saw that one of its chapters presents 6 groups of thinkers: the yin-yang thinkers, Confucians, Moists, those who debated names, or Ming, also known as the dialecticians, the Fa thinkers, often called the legalists, and the Dao De thinkers, those who contemplate Tao and virtuosity. However, even though Sima Qian's text bears the word history in its title, we should not assume that this classification of 6 groups of thinkers was actually a systematic record of different intellectual traditions in China during that early Han period when the text was composed. This classification is neither systematic nor comprehensive. 2 of the groups are identified by their alleged founders, while the other 4 seem to be defined by their core ideas. But what ideas distinguish a given text as belonging to the yin-yang, to the Ming, the Fa, or the Tao groups? Frustratingly, and despite these ambiguities, Sima Qian's labels have dominated how scholars think about China's intellectual traditions right down to the present day. When we look closely at the way in which his Shi Ji sets out the differences between these 6 groups, it becomes obvious that they're used as a set of instructions. The passage assesses each of the 6 groups, pointing out their weaknesses as well as their contributions, like a list of pros and cons for each group. It says of the Confucians that they lack what is essential. They take painstaking efforts, yet with little success. Therefore, it is hard to completely follow their practices. On the other hand, it also says that their focus on propriety and relational positions in life should be maintained. The Shi Ji says of the Moists that their frugality is difficult to adopt, but their emphasis on being economical should not be put aside. These judgments may seem harsh, but aren't necessarily unfair. We saw that Kongzi and other Confucians, for all their inspiring attention to moral cultivation, had trouble reshaping the politics of their time, and Sima Qian is probably right about Moist frugality being a hard act to follow. The instructional tone of the Shiji is even more pronounced when it gets to the Dao thinkers, the Daojia. It places Taoist teachings at the top of a pedestal, saying how this tradition has incorporated important elements from the others. It says, the Taoists promote that humans should unify essence and spirit. In their actions, they align with what is without form, and they find sufficiency with the myriad things. Their technique incorporates yin-yang views on the ongoing succession of events, selects the desirable aspects of Confucian and Moist views, and grasps the essential parts of the views of the School of Names and Legalist School. In doing so, they will be able to adapt to the situation, respond to the transformation of things, stand amidst worldly affairs. There are no situations in which the Taoist actions are not apt. Their instructions are concise and practicable. Their approach is not onerous and yet effective. It would be difficult to say anything more positive about the Taoists than that. They are insightful, strategic in their approach, draw on the high points of the other thinkers, and masterfully put it all together, effectively navigating the world in cosmic, political, and social spheres. The author of this section of the Shiji unambiguously advocates for the Taoist position over the other 5 groups. Not only does the Shiji promote the Taoists, in the passage that follows its praise of Taoist thought, it says, the Confucians are not like that. Because the Confucians regard the ruler as the paradigm of morality, the ruler must labor while his ministers can take it easy. By contrast, the key to the great Tao is to cease pursuing a set of defined values or virtues and instead to rely on technique. This contrast between the Taoists and the Confucians is echoed in another section of the Shiji, in which Kongzi is described as meeting with Lao Tzu, a figure identified as the author of the book named after him, the Lao Tzu. Kongzi seeks out Lao Tzu with the intention of learning from him about ritual propriety. This should already strike us as odd. Why would Kongzi, the ultimate master of ritual propriety, need to seek advice about it? Lao Tzu reacts in what seems a very hostile way, telling Kongzi that the people he looks up to have all already rotted away, both the men and their bones. He also accuses Kongzi of being arrogant and critiques his contrived posturing and overweening ambition. Kongzi takes this on the chin, goes back to his followers, and likens Lao Tzu to a mythical auspicious creature, the Long, often translated as dragon, though we should at least say Chinese dragon, as the Long is quite different from what we mean by dragon. Don't picture St. George and the Dragon, Puff the Magic Dragon, or for that matter, the K-pop star G-Dragon. Although actually G-Dragon may well have magical powers, in which case he would not be unlike an ancient Chinese dragon, which, as we are told in a Han period dictionary, is the longest among the scaly animals. It is capable of appearing and disappearing, contracting and expanding, and shrinking and lengthening. It ascends to heaven at spring equinox and hides in the deep at autumnal equinox. This imagery serves the proponents of Tao philosophy to caricature the Kongzi figure as coming to the realization that the Tao thinkers are right after all. And because the Shiji's views have been influential, the idea of the Confucian-Taoist tension has also been perpetuated in studies of Chinese intellectual history. We also see evidence of Confucian-Taoist antagonism in the Lao Tzu, a short and cryptic text taken as a defining text of the Taoist tradition. Lao Tzu was identified as its author in the Shiji. Its 19th chapter says, "Abandon sageliness and discard wisdom, then the people will benefit 100-fold. Abandon benevolence and discard righteousness, then the people will return to filial piety and deep love. Abandon skill and discard profit, then there will be no thieves or robbers. However, these 3 things are ornaments and are not adequate." Familiar Confucian themes and values are highlighted in this chapter, including sageliness, wisdom, benevolence, and righteousness, as well as the primary relational bond between parents and children. The advice is to leave all these behind, because they are merely ornamental. The passage then tells readers how they should proceed, including by embracing simplicity. Yet, there is reason to doubt that there was always such a strong rivalry between the Confucians and the Taoists. This is largely due to the discovery of 3 versions of the Lao Tzu text, classified as the Lao Tzu A, B, and C. This happened in 1993 in Bojiang. These were part of a significant cache of texts from a tomb which also contained other works such as the Six Virtues and the Thicket of Sayings. In an earlier episode, we saw how these two texts, which were previously unknown, challenged Mengzi's presentation of the views of Gaozi, his opponent. But the versions of Laozi and the Guodian tombs trigger a more seismic shift in our understanding of Chinese intellectual history. The Laozi that scholars over the centuries have been studying, which we can call the received version, is one that has been circulated with a commentary by Wang Bi, a significant scholar of the 3rd century CE. It is generally difficult, if not impossible, to trace how commentators might have edited texts. This is not to say that Wang Bi must have edited the version of the Laozi he worked with, but rather that even at that time there were different versions of the Laozi in circulation. It just so happens that the received version, which is also the one most familiar to scholars, expresses some disdain for Confucian thought. And this is what makes the Guodian Laozi discovery important. We don't see such a head-on challenge to Confucian views. Overall, the 3 versions of the Laozi contain material corresponding to 31 chapters of the received Laozi. 16 of the chapters are close parallels of those in the received texts, while of the remainder, some vary to greater or lesser extents from those in the received Laozi, and some contain material from elsewhere. In Laozi version A, there's a slightly different recension of chapter 19 in the received Laozi. It seems that in Laozi version A, the concern is not specifically about Confucian values, but is rather focused on elements that hinder effective government. So it says, "Forsake knowledge and abandon disputation, and the people will benefit 100-fold. Forsake cunning and abandon profit, and thieves and thugs will cease to exist. Forsake artifice and abandon deception, and the people will once again become as young children." As things to abide by, these 3 phrases are insufficient. Like the passage from chapter 19 in the received Laozi, this version first identifies 3 sets of issues, followed by a proposal to embrace a particular approach. But to state the obvious, it does not target Confucian themes. Instead of asking us to abandon sageliness, wisdom, benevolence, and righteousness, Laozi version A simply advises us to avoid things we, and for that matter Confucians, would think of as undesirable anyway, such as disputation, deception, and profit-seeking. Given that these Guodian versions of the Laozi have been dated to around 300 BCE, scholars have wondered whether the antipathy to Confucianism might have been introduced later. This could also mean that the Shiji perpetuated the Confucian Taoist polemic, or was at least entrenched in this construct of inter-tradition rivalry. Scholar Robert Hendricks thus asks, is the Guodian chapter the original form of the chapter, which was changed at some point to make the chapter more pointedly anti-Confucian? That would be one possible explanation of the differing versions. But whether we accept this explanation or simply say that there were various early recensions of the Laozi text, we will have to recognize that what we call Daoism is complex. And there's more. 2 further versions of the Laozi, written on silk, were unearthed at Mawangji in 1973, together with other texts. These versions contain all 81 chapters of the received text, but place the final 44 chapters of this text before the 37, and this could suggest a different prioritization of themes. There's even more to befuddle us when it comes to the very word Daoism. The English word serves as a translation for Daojia, as we have seen. Traditionally, in English language scholarship, the Daojia has been characterized as the philosophers. However, Daoism also refers to another group of thinkers and texts known as Daojia. Their views are focused on bodily and spiritual cultivation and have been described as Taoist religion, in contrast to the Daojia's philosophy. But we should tread carefully with the word religion, as it only approximates what is meant by Daojia. The scholar Steve Coutinho writes, Daojia refers to a complex set of phenomena, incorporating institutional structures, folk beliefs, rituals, spiritual practices, and sacred texts. It is a pluralistic amalgamation of rival sects and teachings that have developed in lineages over the centuries, such as the Taiping, Quanjian, and Celestial Masters. This succinct snapshot of Daojia effectively brings together some of its components, including its focus on practices, including mystical practices, selected texts, and communities of adherents. These all thrived from the latter half of the Han period. Many problems arise when we drive a distinction along philosophical and religious lines, yet a single English word, Daoism, is required to do all this heavy lifting. There are texts associated with these developments in spiritual practice, even as some of these groups drew on texts from the Warring States period, such as the Laozi and the Shuangzi. Which brings us back to our task of understanding what Daoism might mean in relation to the texts we will be examining in the coming episodes. These include the Laozi, Shuangzi, Liezi, Huainanzi, and Guanzi. The Laozi and Shuangzi have traditionally been identified as the two main texts of Daoism since the early Han. Scholars have taken this cue and taken them as defining the Taoist philosophical tradition. In our Daoism series, we will focus on the views of these two texts, whose composition began in the Warring States period. A third text contains stories, just like the Shuangzi does, and includes versions of some of the Shuangzi's stories. Its authorship and composition dates are unclear. It could be a text compiled from a number of ancient sources. The final two texts, the Huainanzi and the Guanzi, are compilations of written material undertaken by officials and historians in court. The Huainanzi was compiled under the directive of Lui An, king of Huainan, and completed prior to 139 BCE. It covers a vast variety of subjects by drawing from multiple sources, including the Laozi and the Shuangzi, and comments upon them. The way the Huainanzi draws together ideas has been described as syncretic, and we will examine this as a methodology in a later episode. The Guanzi, completed at around 26 BCE, is a compendious text that includes material from as early as the 5th century BCE. Its core focus is on governance and political strategy, with some chapters advocating a mixture of views from Confucian, Taoist, and legalist traditions. This is another example of syncretism. We'll need to discuss whether it is even possible to bring together views from these three factions as we get into the legalist tradition after the Taoist series. What then can we say about Taoism as we begin exploring this tradition? Many things are unclear and will remain so, but let's recap what we've learned so far. First, the idea of Tao philosophy as a distinctive phenomenon was proposed retrospectively in the early Han period, so we should not assume that it was already a well-defined school of thought in the previous time of the Warring States. Second, the Laozi, seen as a definitive text of Tao philosophy, survives in a number of versions. Amongst other things, this makes it difficult for us to get a clear picture on how the Taoist tradition, as we call it, stands in relation to other traditions in its time. Third, the word Taoism may refer to certain practices that we might call religious, as well as to ideas we may more naturally label as philosophical. In this series, we will use the term mainly to describe those ideas, as found in the text we just mentioned. We'll be diving into them more deeply starting next time, with a look at key themes and ideas in the Laozi. Abandon sageliness if you like, discard wisdom if you must, but never forsake the history of philosophy in China.